Chapter 5. About a fortnight after The Life of Shereshevsky appeared, it was greeted by the first artless echo. Valentina Vladimir, in a Russian emigre paper published in Warsaw, wrote as follows: Boris Sherdintsev's new book opens with 6 lines of verse, which the author for some reason calls a sonnet, and this is followed by a pretentiously capricious description of the well-known Shereshevsky's life. Shereshevsky, says the author, was the son of a kindly cleric, but does not mention when and where he was born. He finished the seminary when his father, having lived a holy life which inspired even Nekrasov, died. His mother sent the young man to study in St. Petersburg, where he immediately, practically on the station, became intimate with them molders of opinion, as they were called, Pisarev and Belinsky. The youth entered the university and devoted himself to technical inventions, working very hard and having his first romantic adventure with Lyubov Yegorovna Lobachevsky, who infected him with a love for art. After a clash on romantic grounds with some officer or other in Pavlovsk, however, he was forced to return to Saratov, where he proposed to his future bride and soon afterwards married her. He returned to Moscow, devoted himself to philosophy, wrote a great deal, the novel What Are We to Do, and became friends with the outstanding writers of his time. Gradually he was drawn into revolutionary work, and after one turbulent meeting, where he spoke together with Dobrolyubov and the well-known professor Pavlov, who was still quite a young man at the time, Shereshevsky was forced to go abroad. For a while he lived in London, collaborating with Herzen, but then he returned to Russia and was immediately arrested. Accused of planning the assassination of Alexander II, Shereshevsky was sentenced to death and publicly executed. This, in brief, is the story of Shereshevsky's life, and everything would have been all right if the author had not found it necessary to equip his account of it with a host of unnecessary details, which obscured the sense, and with all sorts of long digressions on the most diversified themes. And worst of all, having described the scene of the hanging and put an end to his hero, he is not satisfied with this, and for the space of still many more unreadable pages he ruminates on what would have happened if Shereshevsky, for example, had not been executed but had been exiled to Siberia, like Dostoevsky. The author writes in language having little in common with Russian. He loves to invent words. He loves long, tangled sentences, whereas, for example, fate sorts them in anticipation of the researcher's needs, or else he places solemn but not quite grammatical maxims in the mouths of his characters. Like the poet himself chooses the subjects for his poems, the multitude he has no right to direct his inspiration. Almost simultaneously with this entertaining review appeared that of Christopher Mortis Paris, who so aroused Zina's indignation that from time to time her eyes glared with their nostrils dilated at the very least mention of the name. When speaking of a new young author, wrote Mortis quietly, one usually experiences the feeling of a certain awkwardness. Will one not rattle him? Will one not injure him to a too glancing remark? It seems to me that in the present instance there are no grounds for such fears. Godunov Sherdintsev is a novice, true, but a novice endowed with extreme self-confidence, and to rattle him is probably no easy matter. I do not know whether his book presages any future achievements or not, but if this is a beginning it cannot be called a particularly reassuring one. Let me qualify this. Strictly speaking, it is completely unimportant whether Godunov Sherdintsev's effort is credible or not. One man writes well, another badly, and everyone is awaited at the end of the road by the theme which none can evade. It is a question, I think, of something quite different. That golden time has passed irretrievably, when the critic or reader could be interested above all by the artistic quality or exact degree of talent of a book. Our immigrant literature, I am speaking of genuine, undoubted literature, people of faultless taste will understand me, has become plainer, more serious, direr, at the expense of art, perhaps, but in compensation, producing in certain poems by Tsipsovich or Boris Varsky in the prose of Korodinov sounds of such sorrow, such music, and such hopeless, heavenly charm, that in truth it was not worth regretting what Lermontov called dull songs of the earth. In itself, the idea of writing a book about the outstanding public figure of the 60s contains nothing reprehensible. One sits down and writes it, fine. It comes out fine. Worse books than that have come out. But the author's general mood, the atmosphere of his thinking, fills one with queer and unpleasant misgivings. I will refrain from discussing the question, how appropriate is the appearance of such a book at the present time? After all, no one can forbid a person to write what he pleases, but it seems to me, and I am not alone in feeling this, that at the bottom of Goodenough Cherdintsev's book there lies something which in essence profoundly tactless, something jarring and offensive. It is his right, of course, although even this could be questioned, to take this or that attitude toward the men of the 60s, but in debunking them, he cannot but awaken any sensitive reader surprise and disgust. How irrelevant all this is, how inopportune. Let me define my meaning. The fact that is precisely now, precisely today, that his tasteless operation is being performed in itself an affront to that significant, bitter, palpitating something which is ripening in the catacombs of our era. Oh, of course, the men of the 60s, and in particular Shereshevsky, expressed in their literary judgments much that was mistaken and perhaps ridiculous. Who is not guilty of this sin? And it is such a sin after all? But in the general intonation of their criticism there transpired a certain kind of truth, a truth which, no matter how paradoxical it seems, has become close and comprehensible to us precisely today, precisely now. I am talking not of their attacks on bribe-takers, nor of the emancipation of women. That, of course, is not the point. I think I shall properly understood, insofar as another can be understood, if I say that in some final infallible sense their and our needs coincide. Oh, I know, we are more sensitive, more spiritual, more musical than they were, and our final aim beneath that resplendent black sky under which life streams on is not simply the commune or the overthrow of the despot, but to us as to them, Nekrasov and Lermontov, especially the latter, are closer than Pushkin. I shall take just this simplest examples because it immediately clarifies our affinity, if not kinship, with them. That chilliness, that foppishness, that irresponsible quality they sensed in a certain part of Pushkin's poetry is perceptible to us too. One may object that we are more intelligent, more receptive. All right, I agree, but essentially it is not a question of Shereshevsky's rationalism, or Belinsky's, or Dobrolubov's. Names and dates do not matter, but of the fact that then, as now, spiritually progressive people understood that mere art and lyre were not a sufficient pabulum. We, their refined and wearied grandchildren, also want something that is above all human. We demand the values which are essential to the soul. This utilitarianism is more elevated, perhaps, than theirs, but in some respects it is more urgent even than the one they preached. I have digressed from the immediate theme of my article, but then sometimes one can express one's opinion with much more exactitude and authenticity by wandering around the theme and its fertile environs. As a matter of fact, the analysis of any book is awkward and pointless, and moreover, we are interested not in the way an author executed his task or even in the task itself, but only in the author's attitude toward it. And let me add this. Are they really so necessary, these excursions into the realm of the past, with their stylized squabbles and artificially vivified way of life? Who wants to know about Shereshevsky's relations with women? In our bitter, tender, ascetic times, there is no place for this kind of mischievous research, for this idle literature, which anyway is not devoid of a certain arrogant audacity that is bound to repel even the most well-disposed of readers. After this, reviews poured. Professor Anichin of Prague University, a well-known public figure, a man of shining moral purity and of great personal courage, the same Professor Anichin who in 1922, not long before his deportation from Russia, when some revolvered leather jackets had come to arrest him, but became interested in his collection of ancient coins, and were slow in taking him away, he had calmly said, pointing to his watch, "Gentlemen, history does not wait," printed a detailed analysis of the life of Shereshevsky in an émigré magazine appearing in Paris. Last year he wrote a remarkable book, came out by Professor Otto Lederer of Bonn University, Three Despots, Alexander the Misty, Nicholas the Chill, and Nicholas the Dull, motivated by a passionate love for the freedom of the human spirit and a burning hatred for its oppressor. Dr. Lederer, in certain of his appraisals, was unjust, taking no account at all, for instance, of that national Russian fervor which so powerfully gave body to the symbol of the throne. But excessive zeal and even blindness in the process of exposing evil is always more understandable and forgivable than the last mockery, no matter how witty it may be, of that which public opinion feels to be objectively good. However, it is precisely this second road, the road of eclectic mordancy, that has been chosen by Mr. Goodenough Cherdintsev in his interpretation of the life and works of N.G. Shereshevsky. The author has undoubtedly acquainted himself thoroughly and in his own way conscientiously with the subject. Undoubtedly, also, he has a talented pen. certain ideas he puts forward and juxtapositions of ideas, and undoubtedly shrewd. With all this, his book is repellent. Let us try to examine calmly this impression. A certain epoch has been taken, and one of its representatives chosen, but has the author assimilated the concept of epoch? No. First of all, the one senses in him absolutely no consciousness of classification of time, without which history turns into an arbitrary gyration of multicolored spots, into some kind of impressionistic picture with a walking figure upside down against a green sky that does not exist in nature. But this device, which destroys, by the way, any scholarly value to the work in question, in spite of its swaggering erudition, does not, nevertheless, constitute the author's chief fault. His chief fault is in the manner in which he portrays Shereshevsky. It is completely unimportant that Shereshevsky understood less about the questions of poetry than the young aesthete of today. It is completely unimportant that his philosophical conceptions of Shereshevsky kept aloof from those transcendental subtleties which pleased Mr. Godunoff-Cherdintsev. What is important is that whatever Shereshevsky's views may have been on art and science, they represented the Weltanschauung of the most progressive men of his era, and were moreover indissolubly linked with the development of social ideas and their ardent, beneficial, activating force. It is in this aspect, and it is in this true light, this sole true light, that Shereshevsky's system of thought acquires a significance which far transcends the sense of those groundless arguments, unconnected in any way with the epoch of the 60s, which Mr. Godunoff-Cherdintsev uses in venomously ridiculing his hero. But he makes fun, not only of his hero, but he also makes fun of his reader. How else can one qualify the facts that among the well-known authorities on Shereshevsky, a non-existent authority is cited, to whom the author pretends to appeal? In a certain sense, it would be possible, if not to forgive, then at least to understand scientifically the scoffing of Shereshevsky. If Mr. Godunoff-Cherdintsev were a heated supporter of those who Shereshevsky attacked, it would at least be a point of view. In reading the book, the reader would make a constant adjustment of the author's partisan approach, in that way arriving at the truth. But the pity is that with Mr. Godunoff-Cherdintsev, there is nothing to adjust, and the point of view is everywhere and nowhere. Not only that, but as soon as the reader, as he descends the course of a sentence, thinks he has at last sailed into a quiet backwater, into a realm of ideas which may be contrary to those of Shereshevsky, but are apparently shared by the author, and therefore can serve as a basis for the reader's judgment and guidance, the author gives him an unexpected fillip, and knocks the imaginary prop from under him, so that he is once more aware as to whose side Mr. Godunoff-Cherdintsev is on in his campaign against Shereshevsky, whether he is on the side of the advocates of art for art's sake, or of the government, or of some other of Shereshevsky's enemies, whom the reader does not know. As far as jeering the hero himself is concerned, here the author passes all bounds. There is no detail too repulsive for him to disdain. He will probably reply that all these details are to be found in the diary of the young Shereshevsky, but they are there in their place, in their proper environment, in the correct order and perspective, among many other thoughts and feelings which are much more valuable. But the author has fished out and put together precisely these, as if someone had tried to restore the image of a person by making an elaborate collection of his combings, fingernail parings, and bodily excretions. In other words, the author is sneering throughout the whole of this book at the personality of one of the purest and most valorous sons of liberal Russia, not to speak of his passing kicks, which he regards the other progressive Russian thinkers, a respect for whom is our consciousness an eminent part of our historical essence. In his book, which lies absolutely outside the humanitarian tradition of Russian literature, and therefore outside literature in general, there are no factual untruths, if one does not count the fictitious Stranyalupsky already mentioned. 2 or 3 doubtful details and a few slips of the pen, but that truth which it contains is worse than the most prejudiced lie, for such a truth goes in direct contradiction to that noble and chaste truth, an absence of which deprives history of that great Greek called tropos, which is one of the inalienable treasures of Russian social thought. In our day, thank God, books are not burned by bonfire, but I must confess that if such a custom were still in existence, Mr. Godunoff-Cherdintsev book would justifiably be considered the first candidate for fueling a public square. After that, Konchiev had his say in the literary annual, The Tower. He began by drawing the picture of a flight during the invasion or an earthquake, when the escapers carry away with them everything that they can lay hands on, someone being sure to burden himself with a large brain portrait of some long-forgotten relative. Just such a portrait, wrote Konchiev, is for the Russian intelligentsia the image of Shereshevsky, which was spontaneously but accidentally carried away abroad by the emigres, together with other, more useful things, and this is how Konchev explained the stupefaction occasioned by the appearance of Fyodor Konstantinovich's book. Somebody suddenly confiscated the portrait. Further on, having finished once and for all with considerations of an ideological nature, and embarked upon an examination of the book as a work of art, Konchev began to praise it in such a way that he has read the review of Fyodor, felt a burning radiance forming around his face and quicksilver racing through his veins. The article ended with the following: "Alas, among the immigration one will hardly scrape up a dozen people who are capable of appreciating the fire and fascination of this fabulously witty composition, and I would maintain that in today's Russia you could not find even one to appreciate it, if I had not happened to know the existence of two such people, one living on the north bank of the Neva, and the other somewhere in the distant Siberian exile." The monarchist organ, The Throne, devoted to the life of Shereshevsky, a few lives in which it pointed out that any sense or value in unmasking of one of the ideological mentors of Bolshevism, was completely undermined by the cheap liberalizing of the author, who goes wholly over to the side of the sorry but pernicious hero as soon as the long-suffering Russian Tsar finally has him safely tucked away, and in general, added the reviewer Pyotr Lovchenko, it is high time one ceased writing about so-called cruelties of the Tsarist regime with regard to pure souls, who are no interest to anybody. The Red Freemasonry will only rejoice over Count Gudanov-Chernintsev's work. It is lamentable that the bearer of such a name should engage in hemming social ideals which have long since turned into cheap idols. The pro-communist Russian language lately in Berlin up. This was one which Vasilev's Gazeta invariably termed the reptile, had an article devoted to the celebration of the centenary of Shereshevsky's birth, and concluded thus: "They have also bestirred themselves in our blessed immigration. A certain Gudanov-Chernintsev, with swashbuckling brashness, has hurried to concoct a booklet for which he has dragged in a material form all over the place, and has given out his vile slander as the life of Shereshevsky. Some Prague professor or other has hastened to find this work, talented and conscientious, and everyone chummily joined in. It is dashingly written, and in no way differs from in its internal style from Vasilev's leaders about the imminent end of Bolshevism. The last dig was particularly amusing in view of the fact that in his Gazeta Vasilev resolutely opposed the slightest reference to Fyodor's book, telling him honestly, although the other had not asked, that he need not been on such friendly terms with him, he would not have printed a devastating review. Not even a damp spot would have remained of the author of the life of Shereshevsky. In short, the book found itself surrounded by a good, thundery atmosphere of scandal which helped sales. And at the same time, in spite of the attacks, the name of Gudanov-Chernintsev immediately came to the fore, rising over the motley storm of critical opinion, in full view of everyone, vividly and firmly. But there was one man whose opinion Fyodor was no longer able to ascertain. Alexander Yakovlevich Shereshevsky had died not long before the book appeared. When the French thinker Delalande was asked at somebody's funeral why he did not uncover himself, "Ne se découvre pas," he replied, "I am waiting for death to do it first. Qu'il se découvre la première." It is a lack of metaphysical gallantry in this, but death deserves no more. Fear gives birth to sacred awe. Sacred awe erects a sacrificial altar. Its smoke ascends to the sky. There assumes the shape of wings, and bowing fear addresses a prayer to it. Religion has the same relation to a man's heavenly condition that mathematics has to his earthly one. Both the one and the other are merely the rules of the game, belief in God and belief in numbers, local truth and the truth of location. I know that death in itself is no way connected to the topography of the hereafter, for a door is merely the exit for the house and not a part of its surroundings, like a tree or a hill. One has to get out somehow, but I refuse to see in a door more than a hole in a carpenter's job. Delalande Discours sur les Alpes, page 45. And then again, the unfortunate image of a road to which the human mind has become accustomed, life as a kind of journey, is a stupid illusion. We are not going anywhere, we are sitting at home. The other world surrounds us always, and is not at all at the end of some pilgrimage. In our earthly house, windows are replaced by mirrors, the door until a given time is closed, but air comes in through the cracks. For our stay-at-home senses, the most accessible image of our future comprehension of those surroundings which are due to be revealed to us with the disintegration of the body is liberation of the soul from the eye sockets of the flesh, and our transformation into one complete and free eye, which can simultaneously see in all directions, or put it differently, a supersensory insight into the world accompanied by our inner participation. Ibid, page 64. But all this is only symbols, symbols which become a burden to the mind, and soon it takes a close look at them. It is not possible to understand more simply, in a way more satisfying to the spirit, without the aid of this elegant atheist, and equally without the aid of popular faiths, for religion subsumes a suspicious facility of general access that destroys the value of its revelations. If the poor can in spirit enter the heavenly kingdom, I can imagine how gay it is there. I have seen enough of them on earth. Who else makes up the population of heaven? Swarms of screaming revivalists, scrubby monks, lots of rosy, short-sighted souls, or more of the less Protestant manufacture. What deathly boredom! I am running a high temperature for the 4th day now, and can no longer read. Strange, I used to think before that Yasha was always near me, that I had learned to communicate with ghosts, but now, when I am perhaps dying, this belief in ghosts seems to be something earthly, linked with the very lowest earthly sensations, and not at all the discovery of a heavenly America. Somehow at once. One effort, and I'll understand all. The search for God, the longing of any hound for a master. Give me a boss, and I shall kneel at his enormous feet. All this is earthly. Father, headmaster, rector, president of the board, czar, God, numbers, and one wants so much to find the biggest number, so that all the rest may mean something and climb somewhere. No, that way you end up in padded dead ends, and everything ceases to be interesting. Of course I am dying. The pincers behind and the steely pain are quite incomprehensible. Death steals up from behind and grasps you by the sides. Funny that I have thought of death all my life, and that if I have lived only in the margin of a book I have never been able to read. Now who has it? Oh, years ago in Kiev. Goodness, what was his name? Would take out a library book on a language he didn't know, make notes in it, and leave it lying about so visitors would think he knows Portuguese, Aramaic. Ich hab das getan. Happiness, sorrow, exclamation marks, homage, while the context is absolutely unknown. A fine affair. It is terribly painful to leave life's womb, the deathly horror of birth. L'enfant qui ne ressent l'affreux de sa mère. My poor little Yasha. It is very queer that in dying I get further away from him, when the opposite should have been true, and ever nearer and nearer. His first word was Muha, a fly, and immediately afterwards there was a telephone call for the police to come and identify the body. How will I leave him now in these rooms? He will have nobody to haunt, because she would not notice. Poor girl. How much? 5,800, plus that other money, which makes, let me see. And afterwards, David might help, but then he might not. In general, there has been nothing in life except getting ready for an examination, which all the same nobody can get ready for. Dreadful is death to man and might alike. Will all my friends go through it? Incredible. Eine Altgeschichte, the name of a film Sandra and I went to see the day before his death. Oh no, under no circumstances. She can keep talking about it as much as she pleases. Was it yesterday she talked about it, or ages ago? No, they won't be taking me to any hospital. I'll lie here. I've had enough of hospitals. It would mean to go mad again just before the end. No, I'll stay here. How difficult it is to turn one's thoughts over, like logs. I feel too ill to die. What did he write his book about, Sandra? Well, tell me. You should remember, we talked about it once, about some priest. Oh, no? Oh, you never? Anything? Bad? Difficult? After this he hardly spoke. Having fallen into a twilight condition, Fedor was admitted to him, and forever remembered the white bristle on his sunken cheeks, the dull shade of his bald head, the hand crusted with grey eczema, stirring like crawfish on the sheet. The following day he died, but before he had a moment of lucidity, complaining of pains and then saying it was darkish in the room because of the lowered blinds. What nonsense! Of course there was nothing afterwards. He sighed, listening to the tickling and drumming outside of the window, and repeated with extreme distinctness, "There is nothing. It is as clear as the fact that it is raining." And meanwhile, outside, the spring sun was playing on the roof of the tiles. The sky was dreamy and cloudless. The tenant upstairs was watering the flowers on the edge of her balcony, and the water trickled down with a drumming sound. In the window of the mortician's on the corner of Kaisarali, there was exhibited as an enticement, just as Cook's exhibits a Pullman model, a miniature crematorium interior. rows of little chairs before a little pulpit, little dolls sitting on them in the size of a bent auricular finger, and in front, and somewhat apart, one could recognize the little widow by the square inch of the handkerchief she had raised to her face. The German seductivity of this model had always amused Fedor, so that it was somehow disgusting to enter a real crematorium, where from beneath laurels and tubs a real coffin with a real body was lowered to the sounds of heavyweight organ music into exhilarating nether regions, right into the incinerator. Madame Shereshevsky did not hold a handkerchief, but sat motionless and straight, her eyes shimmering through the black crepe veil. The faces of friends and acquaintances bore the guarded expressions usual in such cases, a mobility of the pupils accompanied by a certain tension in the muscles of the neck. The lawyer Sharsky sincerely blew his nose. Vasilev, who, as a public figure that had a great deal of funeral experience, carefully followed the person's pauses. Alexander Yakovlevich had turned out at the last minute to be a Protestant. Engineer Kern flashed the lenses of his pince-nez impassively. Goryanov repeatedly freed his fat neck from his collar, but did not go so far as to clear his throat. The ladies who had used to visit Shereshevsky's all sat together. The writers also sat together. Leshevsky, Shamatov, and Shirin. Those were many people whom Fedor did not know. For instance, a prim gentleman with a blond little beard and unusually red lips, a cousin, it seemed, of the dead man, and also some Germans with top hats on their knees, who tactfully sat in the back row. Upon the conclusion of the service of the mourners, according to the scheme of the crematorium's master of ceremonies, were supposed to go up to the widow, one at a time, and offer words of condolence, but Fedor resolved to avoid this, and went out into the street. Everything was wet, sunny, and somehow nudely bright. On a black football field trimmed with young grass, schoolgirls in shorts were doing calisthenics. Behind the crematorium's shiny gutta-percha grey dome, one could see the turquoise turrets of a mosque, and on the other side of the square gleamed the green cupolas of the white Soccan-type church, which had recently grown up out of the corner house, and thanks to architectural camouflage, seemed almost detached. On a terrace by the entrance to the park, two badly wrought bronze boxers, also recently erected, had frozen in attitudes that completely disagreed with the reciprocal harmony of pugilism. Instead of its collected, crouched, round-muscled grace, there were two naked soldiers scrapping in a bathhouse. A kite being flown from an open space behind some trees made a red little rhombus high in the blue sky. With surprise and vexation, Fedor noticed that he was unable to keep his thoughts on the image of the man who had just been reduced to ashes, and got up and spoke. He tried to concentrate, to imagine himself the recent warmth of their live relationship, but his soul refused to budge, and lay there, sleepy eyes shut, content with his cage. The braked line from King Lear, consistent entirely of 5 nevers, that was all he could think of, and so I'll never see him again, he told himself unoriginally. But this thin goad snapped without displacing his soul. He tried to think about death, but reflected instead that the soft sky, edged on one side with a long cloud like a pale and tender border of fat, would have resembled a slice of ham had the blue been pink. He tried to imagine some kind of extension of Alexander Yakovlevich beyond the corner of life, but at the same time could not help noticing through the window of a cleaning and pressing shop near the Orthodox Church, a worker with devilish energy had an excess of steam as if in hell torturing a pair of flat trousers.